Russia had calculated that attrition would eventually break Ukrainian resolve. Every military planner inside the Kremlin believed that sheer weight of numbers, the relentless grinding pressure of human wave assaults across the Eastern Front, would fracture Ukrainian defensive lines before Western support could reconstitute them. However, in the span of just 19 days across a single sector northeast of Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces did not fracture. They shattered 11,000 Russian soldiers across a corridor stretching 40 kilometers, forcing the largest single-front Russian retreat since the collapse of the Kharkiv offensive in 2022. What you are about to witness is not a tactical adjustment. It is the systematic destruction of an entire Russian operational grouping, conducted with a precision and ferocity that has stunned military analysts at every major Western defense institution. The images you are about to see on your screens document something that Russian state media will never show its own citizens. Drone footage geolocated by open-source analysts and verified by the Institute for the Study of War confirms the scale of what has unfolded northeast of Pokrovsk since the 4th of March, 2026. Ukrainian armored columns are not simply holding lines. They are advancing through positions that Russian engineering units spent the better part of 6 months fortifying. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are two specific operational innovations that made this breakthrough not only possible, but mathematically inevitable. We will return to both of them. First, to truly understand what just happened on this front, we need to descend to the frozen ground of Donetsk Oblast on the morning of February 22, 2026, when the sequence of events that produced this extraordinary outcome first began to accelerate. Now we arrive at that moment. The location is a 17-kilometer stretch of Russian defensive positions running from the village of Novoylinka southward toward the Kalinov Reservoir, a line that Russian military planners had designated as anchor territory for their entire northeastern approach to Pokrovsk. According to assessments from the Institute for the Study of War published in the first week of March, this corridor represented one of the most heavily fortified sections of the entire Eastern Front, featuring triple-layered trench systems, pre-positioned ammunition caches totaling an estimated $42 million in stored ordnance, and a garrison drawn from 3 separate Russian combined arms armies. The Kremlin had invested not merely soldiers, but the prestige of 3 separate military commands in holding this ground. Ukrainian military intelligence, operating under the directorate led by General Kirilo Butinov, had spent 11 weeks mapping every element of that investment. Every supply route, every communication node, every ammunition transfer point. On the night of February 22nd, that mapping became a targeting list. What followed over the next 19 days represents a masterclass in what NATO doctrine refers to as deep battle operations, and it requires careful examination to understand why it worked with such devastating efficiency. Ukrainian forces employed a layered strike architecture that began not at the front line, but approximately 60 kilometers behind it. Fiber optic controlled FPV drones, a technology that Ukrainian engineers have refined to a degree that has no parallel in Russian inventory, began systematically eliminating Russian logistics arteries on the night of February 22nd. These drones operate entirely outside the electromagnetic spectrum that Russian electronic warfare systems are designed to disrupt. They carry no radio signal. They follow a physical tether of fiber optic cable that transmits control inputs and live video simultaneously, making them immune to every jamming system Russia has deployed along the Eastern Front. Ukrainian drone operators, working in rotating shifts from positions well behind the contact line, conducted what defense analyst Michael Kaufman of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace later described as the most sustained deep strike logistics interdiction campaign conducted by any non-state or state actor since the Gulf War. Over 19 days, Ukrainian fiber optic drone operators destroyed or rendered operationally unusable an estimated 237 vehicles, including fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, and the mobile command posts that Russian battalion tactical groups depend on to coordinate fire support requests. Without fuel and ammunition flowing forward, the 3 Russian combined arms armies holding that 17-kilometer corridor could not rotate their forces, could not resupply their forward positions, and critically, could not concentrate artillery fire against Ukrainian assault columns when those columns finally moved. But that is not the most shocking element of what Ukraine accomplished on this front. There is a second capability that changed the mathematics of this engagement entirely, and it involves a technology that Russia simply has no answer for. Ukrainian ground robotic systems, specifically the UGV platforms developed under the Brave 1 Defense Technology Cluster and operated by elements of the 3rd Assault Brigade, conducted what military analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington have described as the first operationally decisive autonomous ground engagement in modern warfare. These platforms, remotely operated but capable of autonomous navigation across pre-mapped terrain, conducted over 7,000 individual missions in the Pokrovsk sector between February 22nd and March 13th. They performed reconnaissance functions that would otherwise require human scouts in extreme risk environments. They delivered anti-tank munitions against armored positions that had previously been too heavily defended to approach. And critically, they performed the continuous harassment function that depletes infantry will to resist, attacking Russian forward positions at unpredictable intervals throughout both day and night cycles in a manner that no human unit could sustain over a 19-day continuous operation. According to Ukrainian Ground Forces command statements verified by Ukrainian defense journalists embedded with the 3rd Assault Brigade, Russian infantry units holding forward trenches in the Novolinka sector reported an average of 14 separate drone or robotic ground vehicle attacks per day during the peak of the operation. 14 attacks per day, every day, for 19 days. The psychological toll on Russian defenders was documented in intercepted communications shared by Ukrainian military intelligence on March 9th, in which Russian soldiers described the experience as fighting an enemy that never sleeps, never eats, and never fears death, because the enemy they were fighting was, increasingly, a machine. This brings us to the strategic implication layer. And this is where things get genuinely significant for the broader trajectory of the war. The destruction of 11,000 Russian soldiers across a single front in 19 days is not merely a tactical achievement, regardless of how extraordinary the tactical execution was. What Ukraine has demonstrated in the Pokrovsk sector is proof of a replicable operational concept. The combination of fiber-optic FPV deep strike logistics interdiction and autonomous ground robotic harassment does not require the numerical parity that conventional military doctrine demands for offensive operations. Ukrainian forces achieved this breakthrough while remaining numerically outnumbered in the sector by an estimated ratio of approximately 1.4 to 1. In conventional military doctrine, attacking forces are expected to require a 3 to 1 numerical advantage to overcome prepared defenses. Ukraine did it at a numerical disadvantage, because the fiber optic and robotic systems effectively multiplied Ukrainian combat power beyond what human headcount alone would suggest. According to retired U.S. Army General Ben Hodges, speaking to Defense News on March 15th, the Pokrovsk operation represents a fundamental challenge to Russian manpower-based strategy. If Ukraine can replicate this operational template across 2 or 3 additional sectors simultaneously, Russia faces a crisis that additional mobilization waves cannot solve, because the problem is not the number of Russian soldiers. The problem is that Russian soldiers, in sufficient numbers, are increasingly powerless against systems that operate faster than human reaction times and cannot be stopped by the electronic warfare tools Russia has spent billions developing. Now let us expand the frame, because what happened northeast of Pokrovsk does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a much larger context of converging pressures that are fundamentally altering the strategic position Russia entered 2026 believing it had secured. In January of 2026, Kremlin-aligned commentators and Russian state media were projecting confidence. The argument they made, repeated across Russian television programs and in interviews given by officials close to the presidential administration, was that Western political fatigue had reached a terminal point. Elections in France, Germany, and the continued political turbulence in the United States had, in Moscow's assessment, fatally weakened the coalition sustaining Ukraine. Russia, this logic held, simply needed to hold on. Time was Russia's weapon, and time appeared to be running in its direction. That calculation has collapsed. In February of 2026, the European Union finalized the 47th tranche of military assistance to Ukraine, valued at €6.2 billion, and including the first direct transfer of Eurofighter Typhoon components to support Ukrainian Air Force integration planning. Germany, following the appointment of the new defense coalition government in Berlin, increased its bilateral defense commitment to Ukraine by 31% over its 2025 baseline, bringing total German military support since February 2022 to an estimated 38 billion euros. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are now collectively spending an average of 4.1% of GDP on defense, levels not seen in European nations outside of wartime since the Cold War. And Poland, which has emerged as perhaps the single most consequential European military actor in terms of Ukraine's long-term sustainment, has now completed its purchase order for 1,000 K2 Black Panther tanks from South Korea, with delivery schedules running through 2027, while simultaneously expanding its land forces from 100,000 to a projected 350,000 active personnel. The Baltic Sea has become, as NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte stated in a press conference on March 7th, a NATO lake without qualification or caveat. Russia's northwestern strategic flank is no longer contested space. It is encircled space. The economic dimension of Russia's strategic position deserves equally direct examination because the numbers that have emerged from Russian government statistical releases, analyzed by the Kiev School of Economics and independently verified by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, tell a story that Russian state media is working furiously to suppress. Russia's defense spending in 2025 consumed an estimated 41% of the total federal budget, a proportion that has no peacetime or even wartime precedent in Russian fiscal history outside of the Soviet mobilization of the 1940s. Inflation in the Russian consumer economy reached an annualized rate of 17.3% in the final quarter of 2025, according to data compiled by the Central Bank of Russia itself, a number that Russian economic officials publicly disputed but have been unable to refute. Trade volume between Russia and China, the relationship that Kremlin strategists positioned as their economic lifeline when Western sanctions were imposed, fell to $228 billion in 2025, a decline of approximately 7% from the prior year, driven by Chinese banking institutions enforcing secondary sanction pressure from the United States with increasing rigor. Russia is spending more, earning less, and paying for the difference with currency debasement that is quietly destroying the purchasing power of ordinary Russian citizens in ways that government statistics can obscure but cannot prevent. Now we must look at the human dimension of what is unfolding on the ground inside Russia, because behind the strategic calculations and the economic statistics, there are individual human beings making impossible choices inside a system that has stopped telling them the truth. Intercepted communications released by Ukrainian military intelligence on March 11th include messages sent by Russian soldiers in the Pokrovsk sector to family members in the days before the Ukrainian breakthrough. One soldier, whose message was shared without identifying information to protect his family still inside Russia, wrote to his mother that he had not received hot food in 9 days, that his unit had been promised rotation 2 months earlier and the rotation had not come, that he did not know what they were fighting for anymore, but that asking that question aloud was more dangerous than the Ukrainian drones. The man behind those words is not a monster. He is a victim of a system that has lied to him about why he is there and what his sacrifice means. According to estimates compiled by Mediazona, the independent Russian investigative outlet, Russia has now confirmed at least 112,000 combat deaths since February 2022. An independent demographic analysis suggests the true figure may be significantly higher, potentially exceeding 300,000 when accounting for deaths that Russian authorities classify under other causes to avoid official military casualty reporting. These are not numbers. They are fathers, sons, and brothers, fed into what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described on March 14th as an unquenchable furnace that serves only one man's refusal to acknowledge a catastrophic miscalculation. Inside the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin's strategic calculus is not operating on the same timeline or emotional register as the soldiers freezing in Donetsk. According to analysis from the German Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, shared with European partner agencies and subsequently reported by Der Spiegel in its March 8th edition, Putin's strategic posture remains anchored in a single conviction: that the political will of Western democracies will fracture before Russian military capacity is exhausted. He is not fighting Ukraine. He is fighting the electoral calendars of Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, and Washington. He trusts the political pressures inside Western democracies more than he trusts his own generals' battlefield assessments. That is why the Pokrovsk breakthrough represents something beyond a military defeat. It is an empirical disproof of the foundational assumption on which Russia's entire 2026 strategy rests. Because if Ukraine can destroy 11,000 soldiers on one front in 19 days while Western support holds and European defense spending accelerates, then the timeline Putin is waiting for may never arrive. The coming months will determine whether this pattern holds or whether Russia can adapt faster than analysts currently believe. Several critical variables will define the trajectory between now and the summer of 2026. First, whether Ukraine's production of fiber optic FPV systems can scale to support simultaneous multi-sector operations. Current production estimates from Ukrainian Defense Ministry statements suggest capacity is expanding, but replicating the Pokrovsk template across 3 fronts simultaneously would require a drone inventory of a scale Ukraine has not yet publicly confirmed achieving. Second, whether Russia's mobilization apparatus can generate sufficient replacement forces to stabilize the northeastern Donetsk sector before Ukrainian forces exploit the gap created by the 11,000 casualty attrition event. Russia's third mobilization wave, announced in January of 2026, has reportedly encountered significant logistical problems in equipment allocation, with newly conscripted units receiving weapons systems described by Ukrainian battlefield capture documentation as being of 1970s manufacture. Third, and perhaps most consequentially, whether the political agreement framework being discussed in closed-door contacts between European capitals and Kiev regarding long-term security guarantees can be formalized before Russian information operations succeed in fracturing European political unity ahead of scheduled elections in Poland and Romania in the second half of 2026. The answers to these 3 questions will determine whether the Pokrovsk breakthrough is remembered as the turning point the war has been waiting for, or as one more chapter in a conflict that refuses to resolve on any timeline that human patience can comfortably absorb. The suddenly phase of this war, the phase analysts have been anticipating, may be much closer than even optimistic assessments have dared to project. What you have witnessed in the Pokrovsk sector is not simply 11,000 Russian soldiers retreating under Ukrainian pressure. It is the empirical proof that the strategy Putin built his 2025 and 2026 on, attrition over time, Western exhaustion, numerical supremacy, has a fatal vulnerability that Ukraine has identified, developed, and is now beginning to scale. The machine that Russia brought to eastern Ukraine is not undefeatable. Ukraine is learning, right now, exactly how to defeat it. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you believe Ukraine can replicate this operational template across multiple sectors simultaneously before Russia stabilizes its northeastern lines? Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video so that this analysis reaches the audience that needs to see it. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.